The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an a-leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your ISM? Hello and welcome to What's Your ISM? I am Sudipto Mondal. Now, this is the 27th episode of What's Your ISM, and I'm very glad that a lot of the people who've been following this show have noticed that we've been away for 2 weeks. Thanks for taking notice. And here we are back again with another very special guest, Kalpana Sharma, one of the senior most women journalists in the country, an investigative journalist, somebody who spent 4 or 5 decades in journalism, has been around since 1972. 5 decades in journalism, worked with the Hindu, Indian Express, Times of India, and started her career with Himmat. We will talk about Himmat and what Kalpana was doing there. I had a chance to check out some of the archives. Kalpana Sharma, thank you so much for joining us. I had the pleasure of reading your 2 books to prepare for this interview, Rediscovering Dharavi. This was in the year 2000?
Yes.
2000. And the more recent, Silence and the Storm, which is on violence against women in India.
Yes.
Kalpana, there's a lot I want to talk to you about. Of course, I've been a fan and somebody who started by reading your work when I joined in the Hindu, 2007, those years. I want to start, though, with something that is current. My colleague Pooja Prasanna, she was in Bombay, and she said, if you're getting Kalpana, you must talk to her about what's happening in Dharavi. Can we start from there? Because you have a book on Dharavi, and Dharavi, I believe today is in the news because of all that Adani stuff. So before we get going, can we get into this current affairs thing? And can you tell me what's happening in Dharavi in the elections and with this specter of Adani's projects hanging around?
To me, it's ironic. I did the research for my book in 1999, and it was published in 2000. And even then, already, people were eyeing that piece of land, those 600 acres on which Dharavi is situated, without any understanding of what Dharavi is. And already then people were aware of this because it was the value of the land that all these builders and developers were interested in. And not the fact that Dharavi, which I wrote in my book, was like a mini India. It actually came as a surprise to me to see how these communities had melded together, how nobody was dependent on the state. In fact, they contributed to the state exchequer with the kind of work they did. And yet they were getting very little from the state, even though they were doing all this. And the interest in the land was only because Bandra Kurla at that time was just being developed. So, Dharavi lies across the Methi River. And that is the reason that there was this interest. And, the slum development project, none of those things had come in at that point. They just started. 95, 98, they just started. But it was just very nascent. But to me, that's why I feel a sense of deja vu, because today it's exactly the same. Whether it's Adani, whether it's anybody else, there's the whole story of how Adani got the contract in the first place, which obviously was a way of maneuvering, the bids. But even now, he's demanding all this additional land, which is nothing else but land grab, because the whole point of redeveloping Dharavi was to let people who live there stay there,
Right. Now, just can we break it down a little step by step? So Adani gets these contracts. There's a political context in which he gets these contracts to redevelop this thing. If we can go a little step by step, tell me what happened.
So I'll just explain that already in 2004 was the first time the whole concept of redeveloping Dharavi came up. And there was a guy who was an architect from the US who came to India, and he sold this idea in 2004. And so Dharavi was divided into 5 sectors, and the idea was that for each sector there would be a bid, and then there would be redevelopment. But that thing never took off. It was only one sector that the Maharashtra government itself undertook to redevelop and started doing some work. Meantime, already some redevelopment had taken place, because there was, for all of Bombay, there was a redevelopment plan called the SRA, Slum Redevelopment Plan D. And so some communities had gotten together and built these 7-story structures, because that was the rule. You couldn't go over 7 stories. And so you saw around Dharavi some of this happening. But it all fell by the way, because I think, as always in these redevelopment plans, there is money, there is other kind of interests, and they somehow didn't coalesce. And there were changes of government. So finally, there was a bid made for all of Dharavi. So something called the Dharavi Redevelopment Authority was set up. And the idea then was that any other kind of redevelopment plan, like the existing one, will be put aside. So people could not then organize themselves to get their settlements redeveloped, and they had to fall under the Dharavi redevelopment plan. And the thing is, when that happened is when the big money came in, because we're talking about 600 acres across from Bandra Kurla. So when it was just these little sectors, it was not so interesting for the builders and the developers. So to break it up further, in the earlier government, when there was a Shiv Sena BJP government, these sectors, there were bids made, and the highest bids came from a company based in Dubai called Seclink. So it won the bid, and it looked like it was going through. So the second bid was Adani. It was much lower. I mean, this Seclink was some 7,000 something crores. Adani was 4,000 to 5,000 crores. But what they did was they said there's not enough land for resettling people in the meantime, while the redevelopment is taking place. So the railways gave some land for this. And because the railway land had not been part of the original tender, when the breakaway Shiv Sena, NCP, and the BJP formed this government, they said that tender is not valid anymore, the Seclink tender. And thereby, the second tender, which was Adani, that's how he got it. So, on paper, it looks like completely legitimate, but we know that there are other maneuverings that go on. And since Adani has taken over and, the Sena, Uddhav Thackeray and the MVA were out and these other people came in, this is what's going on, because the local people are saying it's not that we don't want development. We want it. But we want to say, A, we want to say in it. B, we want to make sure that those of us who have these little industries, where they produce so many things. I mean, like literally anything you want, you can get that up. We don't want those displaced. And thirdly, even those who've been staying on rent, for instance, they have lived there now for decades. So you can't send them away to some other place where they'll have no livelihood. And they have a legitimate right also for some part of this land. Now, that is where, and there's no survey, there's no recent survey done. They're still doing a survey of exactly how many people are legit and how many are not legitimate. It's a mess. So local people, a lot of them are opposing Adani because they're seeing that what is being done is gradually a lot of people will be told you're not entitled to live in Dharavi, but we'll give you some other accommodation on rental away from Dharavi. And then it'll be almost like a greenfield project, because they can remove vast tracts of land with where there are settlements already, and then they'll develop it for whatever, usually for high-end housing, for office space, which is what the plan is.
And, I was reading stuff that you have shared yourself on your timeline and, around this issue. Now, there's also this, okay, let me understand it. Now, the plan was that Adani would develop this place for the residents over there. Then the question comes as to who are the residents. Is it
Correct.
is it people who are living there, or is it people who are entitled to live over there? So therefore, the question comes as to who is entitled. There's suddenly one cutoff date that is being discussed, which is that if you have been here since what, 1972 or something like that,
2000.
2000. Okay,
No,
no,
let me explain this cutoff date.
yeah.
That's a cutoff date is something that is part of the whole discussion on slum redevelopment in Mumbai.
No, this
It's been
cutoff
there for
date,
a long time.
I wanted to talk
Uh,
about this cutoff date, and I wanted to perhaps dwell on how, in different contexts, it is used to marginalize people, to cut out people. Like, because just yesterday we got a press note,
yeah,
about this Human Rights Law Network, which put out this press note on the Supreme Court order on Section 6. In the Assam context, where you
yeah,
have this 1972 cutoff,
cutoff.
to decide as to who
Yes,
can be given citizenship, who cannot be given citizenship. This cutoff thing, right? It's literally such a laceration on
yeah,
human bodies, right? So anyway, please
correct.
go on this. Go
Yeah,
on, yeah.
yeah. So I mean, in Mumbai, as I've written in my book on Dharavi,
Yeah.
this cutoff date was like a moving target. It started off with 1972, then it went to 1975, then it went to 80, then 85, and so on and so on. And currently it is 2000. So basically, people who can produce papers to show that they were living where they are living now before 2000, they are entitled. But in all our slums and informal settlements, there are people, of course, who still live where they originally started living, but many of them have moved out and rented out those properties, either as shops or as workshops. Above the workshops, there are workers who've been living there and working there. And so, and they may have been before 2000, but they would not have any papers to prove it. So they are as entitled, even though they're not so called owners. Actually, nobody owns,
Right.
because the land is either government land or BMC land or some private land. These are structures that are on that land. So they don't own the land, but they can only claim that they were living there, and that is their ownership. So it's a very complicated, layered thing. And the last survey that was done was, I think, there was one in 1985, and then there was one afterwards in 2008 or 9, I forget, which was done by an NGO based in Pune called Mashal, and they give an approximate figure of how many could prove that they had been living there and how many rentees there were. And it comes to a huge number, much more than what the government was claiming.
And so, in between all of this, is this talk about a dump yard called Deonar? Deonar, how do you
Yes,
say it?
yeah,
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 Deonar.
yeah.
So now these people who have been cut off, so to speak, the proposal is to take these cut off people and dump them right in the middle of Deonar.
I mean, it just defies anything I can imagine, because, all over the world, it is clear that you cannot build housing on dump sites, even if they have not had anything more dumped on them for several decades. It takes many decades for them to be actually clear of the toxins that are there. And if you build housing, whatever it is, those toxins will rise. In the US, in fact, I think in the 50s, there was a famous case on this, where there had been housing built. The people who bought those houses had no idea. And then they developed all kinds of sickness. And that's when they realized that it was a toxic site on which the housing had been done. So, in this day and age, when all this information is available, the BMC has that information when they and they themselves have said it will take 6 decades for that site to be ready for any kind of habitation. And yet they're just going ahead with these kind of proposals. But, the one thing I think to understand, Sudipto, is that what is behind it is basically land grab. This is all government land, so-called fallow land, which nobody owns or somebody owns, and you take it over. And once you have construction, once you build things, leave alone Devnar. I mean, there's Mulund, there's the salt pans. The salt pans are essential for Bombay because ecologically they're the ones that prevent the flooding, because they take the water, when the sea surges, just like mangroves. So if you remove salt pans or you fill them as they're planning to do, you are actually creating a situation for more flooding into the city. And yet they're talking of filling the salt pan lands and building there. And again, the people who will live there will have this problem, of flooding. Yeah.
No, this show, right? Like here we of course, when journalists comes, we try and analyze isms. When academics or activists come, we try and analyze their ism. But here you're a journalist, so I was wondering, we talk about fascism, right? And there is, of course, this thing of land grab that you spoke about and all of that. But in fascism, they want to industrialize this business of getting rid of the undesirables. Right. And the reason I say this is because one of the stories that you shared, one of the reporters described this Deonar relocation project as sending people to the gas chambers. And it was like very stark for me, that comparison, because the areas which exist outside or around Deonar today are places where you have the lowest life expectancy. Supposedly, the average life expectancy in some of the neighborhoods around Deonar is 40 years. And things corrode, electrical appliances start corroding because of the fumes and what have you. So do you see this as a relocation project for the undesirables? Because Dharavi also has this portrayal, right? It's one of those eyesores and just get them out of the way. So one side, whatever, you beautify it, another side, just get them out of the way.
Actually, Dharavi doesn't have this image of undesirables. That's not true. Within Mumbai, I think Dharavi, when I started my research and I used to talk to, say, pavement dwellers and say, I'm working on something on Dharavi, they'd say, wo to Jhopatpatti ki Rani hai. That is the queen of the slums, as far as they were concerned. Yeah. So many of them would have wanted to move from the pavement to Dharavi. So, but the urban poor are undesirable for the certain class of people who would like to make Mumbai into this global city. So, and they have still no understanding. I'm amazed after all these years that the city would come to a standstill if the urban poor were pushed out, because everything runs because of them. The area where I live, there's a big urban poor settlement, and all the buildings around, the drivers, the watchmen, the cleaners, the people who work in your houses, the cooks, everybody lives there, and they all come and work in all these buildings. And if tomorrow that disappeared, nobody here would have any help, as they experienced during COVID in any case, because nobody was able to come, enter the buildings. So, despite all this, the entitled in Mumbai still would like the slums to disappear, and um, and pushing them to the edges. This has been done in Delhi, as you know, people were pushed out. This is the pattern. In Mumbai, you can't quite do that because Mumbai is too integrated for people to be pushed out. Plus, there's a Supreme Court judgment which very clearly says that where a piece of land which has been so-called encroached is not needed for any public purpose, then the people who've been living there have the right to remain. That can be redeveloped in situ. People can live there. So that is the whole basis of that slum redevelopment plan, which was also in '95. So given that, the entire place can't be shifted out because Dharavi doesn't come in the way of anything. So I don't know. I personally would not draw such conclusions. But let me say that already the settlements that have been done of people, say, who uh, lived along pavements on the main roads which had to be widened, they have been sent to virtual, you can call them gas chambers, because they've been sent to areas where the air is so bad that, in fact, a book was written about TB, which looked at one of these areas in Mumbai. And it showed that because of the whole way in which these buildings are built, where there's no space, there's hardly 6 feet between these 7-story buildings, there's no light, no air. And therefore, if one person gets TB, everybody gets it. And then because they're poor, they don't go in time for treatment and they develop this multi-drug resistant
Right.
TB. And that's right here in Bombay, where we have the best hospital facilities. But they've just been literally dumped there because they were told you have to clear out from the pavements. There's this area called Mahul, which is also, near where the Bharat Petroleum and other refineries are, where people are constantly ill because of the foul air there. So that's equivalent to a gas chamber. So this has been happening. If the government can push them out and redevelop that land for other purposes, they will. When they cannot, then you get this kind of thing, what's going on now, where they want to push as many as they can out. They know that there are a certain number they will not be able to. And I can tell you, if this project ever comes through, those people will be pushed to one corner of that 600 acres in probably 20-story, towers, which are dysfunctional for their way of life and the way they operate. And the rest of the area will be then redeveloped for high-end housing and office space. That is the vision they have, which they will not talk about openly at the moment. Yeah.
Sure, sure. And tell me, how, last question on this, this Dharavi redevelopment project, is how does it play out in the elections? Because that's something I want to kind of wrap in terms of the current affairs section, get that sense, because I understand that there is the Gaikwad sisters, Varsha Gaikwad and Jyoti Gaikwad. Jyoti Gaikwad, correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
They are quite prominent, Ambedkarite, and, very anti-establishment and all of that, So tell me, how is it playing out over there? Are they taking up this issue? I understand the Congress has given Jyoti a ticket this time.
Yeah. So, my information from Dharavi is a little dated. I haven't been there in recent times because I'm not reporting in that kind of granular way that one did earlier. But, the profile of Dharavi has actually not
Your mentees
changed all
are.
that. Sorry?
Your mentees are, I understand.
But the profile of Dharavi, I think people don't realize this, that even whether it's Tamils who live there, whether it's the Maharashtrians who live there, many of them are, and even the Haryanvis, there's a whole Valmiki colony. So, traditionally there's been a large Dalit presence in Dharavi. And Eknath Gaikwad, who's the father of Varsha Gaikwad, he was there for years and years, and was a known name among the Dalit communities. So it's not as if it's suddenly there's Dalit mobilization. It's there. It's very solid. So, going by that kind of calculation, I can't see why Jyoti would not win if Varsha won the. Traditionally Congress has held on to that constituency, but you can't say this time because all these splits in the regional parties has created a lot of confusion. So I don't know. I cannot give you a clear answer of what the mood is at the moment because I have not been in the last, recently to get a sense of that, and it's difficult. But as I said, I think a lot of people have to understand that profile, and I really don't think that profile has changed all that much. I think that still remains the profile, that it is largely, Dalit amongst even the different communities that are there, and there are others, of course. It's a great mix. It's an amazing place, actually. And anybody who starts going to Dharavi is amazed, including international scholars, by this mix of population, the way they have lived together all this time. Of course, there were rifts during the 92-93 communal riots. But since then, work is the ethic. And it's amazing. They just get on with the job and they do it. From making, all kinds of foods to jewelry to mending suitcases, selling leather, garments, what have you, anything.
And your book, of course, is a great primer for people, even now reporters who are going there. I understand, like I told you, my colleagues from TNM, Pooja Prasanna and all that, they were there in Dharavi. So the first thing everybody does is, read that book of yours. My brother actually is trying to do a documentary on Buddhism. He is in Dharavi and picked up this book of yours. So please do, of course, pick up this book by Kalpana Sharma. It's not a dated one. It's 20 years old, 24 years old now, and it's still relevant. It's called Rediscovering Dharavi. Another thing about Kalpana Sharma, of course, is that she's a treasure out here in this ecosystem of TNM and NL. If you haven't checked out her column, it's called Broken News. You must please check it out. And of course, if you want to access it, you can get the joint TNM NL subscription to access that column. Now, Kalpana, there's this current affairs section out of the way. Now, I really want to get into something which goes back to the beginning. Let's go into the beginning stage. We're talking about the 70s and a young Kalpana Sharma working in this weekly magazine published out of Bombay called Himmat. Yeah, started by Rajmohan Gandhi. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll let you talk about that first. I, of course, went and dug into that archive of Himmat. The Himmat archive is online up until 1973, starting in 63 or 65 up until 64 till 81 or something it was published. Yeah.
Yes, 81 was closed.
Yeah. And the online editions are, I think, between 63 and 73. About 10 years of editions are up online, so please go check that out. It's a piece of history. Kalpana, tell me about how you started your career in Himmat.
Well, it was, I think, a series of accidents. It's very funny when I think back on it. Journalism or joining the IAS were the two things that I had wanted to do. And I'm a child of that generation. Of course, Nehru died while I was just out of school, but that kind of idealism, like our school principal would always tell us, you're privileged to go to such a good school. What are you going to give back to the country? I mean, it all sounds very sort of
All this is happening in
strange.
Bombay. You studied in
No,
Bombay.
I was in Jaipur.
Acha.
Yeah, I was in a boarding school. And so, at that time, it wasn't considered strange to be nationalistic in that sense, to feel you had to do something for your country, and this thing of your privilege, what are you giving back to your society, was it was just like part of the discussion. And making a career just to make money for yourself was not part of it. And I had uncles who were in they were in the CPM, and I knew their example where they'd given up everything. And so it was all. And my aunt was with the Congress party, had been with them since the independence struggle, and was in the Mahila. So there was this kind of atmosphere around. So I think for me, finally, I decided it was journalism, and luckily for me, Himmat started. I was, knew Rajmohan Gandhi, and many of us were really. I mean, I learnt on the job. I learnt by joining Himmat. I didn't go to journalism school, and we
You were
learnt
already what,
everything.
in your mid-20s by the time you joined Himmat?
I was early 20s, I think. Yeah, yeah, and so it was 72 that I joined. And we were at like 3.5 people basically, plus the editor was Mr. Lala, RM Lala, Rusi Lala. And we had to do everything. So there was no question that, I could do this. You could come up with ideas of the story you wanted to do because it was a weekly. But he was quite game to let you do, a civic story if you wanted, if you could pitch it in a way, because it was not just a Bombay weekly, it was read elsewhere.
Exactly. So that's what struck me. So, guys, okay. So Himmat is, like Kalpana said, a 3 people outfit, but it is writing about pretty much all of Asia, right? It's covering the Wimbledon in some way. It is covering the Commonwealth. I mean, there's a huge wingspan. It is somewhat like I don't know. I don't know if the comparison is correct, but somewhat like a Himal magazine of that era. It has a very South Asia kind of perspective.
It was weekly, and the number of pages depended on the number of ads you could get. So sometimes it would really shrink, and other times it would expand. During Diwali, for instance, we would get more ads, so there would be a bigger edition.
Right.
Regular edition was about roughly 24 pages of an A4 size, which is not much. And so your articles had to be really short. I had to learn proofreading. I had to learn how pages are made up on the letterpress. We were typewriter generation, so we had to type our copy. And somebody who used to edit would then edit it in a pencil. Then you had to retype it before it was sent for typesetting, and then you had to proofread it. So it was terrific learning. It was a hands-on learning. And I think I did everything from some politics to sort of city issues. And I remember even writing a piece on chess on Spassky and Fischer, who at that time was the big story, this American and this Russian at the height of the Cold War. Yeah. I mean, that was based on, of course, whatever information one could get. But
It was
so
also,
I couldn't have asked for a better training school than Himmat for journalism.
or let's even say a better context to start off your career in, right? Because these were the beginning years of the trouble years. Because 72 is when you slowly see attempts to kind of curtail the press a little bit. I saw one news item in the Himmat, where they kind of go on sarcastically against the government, where the government tried to reduce the number of pages a newspaper
Yes.
could have, saying that, oh, we want to promote smaller publications and kind of contain monopolies. So these large
Yes.
newsrooms are able to produce a 20-page publication, but then the smaller ones are not able to afford it. So to ration
Yeah.
newsprint and all that logic they use, and ultimately, of
Yeah.
course, it got thrown out by the Supreme Court. So there are these little rumblings happen up until the emergency. I want you to talk about what happened during the emergency, because you were in Himmat at that point.
Yes.
But before
Yes.
that, I like I said, I did some digging, and I found that in 1973, you did like some very, very, how do I say, diametrically opposite things in terms of. So there's an article on the Wimbledon. Okay, this is, wait, when is this Wimbledon article? This is a June 1973 issue. And Kalpana writes about this tussle between the ATP, which is the Association of Tennis Professionals,
Yes,
and the International Lawn Tennis.
finding me.
Yeah, I found this article, and then that's in June 73. In July, okay, I don't know if you traveled or whatever. It seemed like you were in Mozambique, where okay, so it was probably from here. I wonder how you aggregated the article, but it's an article about Portuguese colonialism, what's happening in Africa at that point, trade relations, emerging revolutionaries, warlords and all of that. There's one piece in July. And somewhere in August, you're reporting on the Commonwealth. And this one, I think you went to Canada. It was in, yeah,
Yes,
it was in Ottawa.
73, yeah.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing you mentioned. So you guys are not allowed inside. It's a closed door meeting. All the heads of the Commonwealth, and just, I think they're allowed only one secretary in that meeting to keep
Yeah.
things tight and all of that. And you are just circling around. There is a huge posse of journalists. You're not allowed inside. And this interesting aside about Idi Amin. Idi Amin couldn't turn up for that meeting because he asked the Queen of England for a plane. She didn't lend it to him. He asked somebody else for a plane. He couldn't get a plane, so he didn't turn up for the Commonwealth event. So you're out there in Ottawa. Tell me about this year, 1973. What was happening? You were all over the place.
Well, this thing of writing whatever you were assigned. So if the editor thought we needed a piece on Madagascar, well, I had to just figure out a way of getting that information, reading up. There was no internet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it meant the friendly newspaper for us was the Indian Express. So I could go to Indian Express and look in their library and find things, that I could read, and just somehow try and understand, some background on Madagascar. I didn't know anything. In fact, started from scratch. But the editor was actually somebody who did know quite a lot, so he would also brief me. Wimbledon, I love tennis, so I've been following the whole controversy. So that was not such a big thing. And this Commonwealth thing, they raised the money a bit like everybody does nowadays, and I was sent.
Was that your first foreign assignment?
First foreign assignment, yeah. So first time I'd gone to something like this, I had no idea where to start. But for me, again, the older Indian journalists who were already located in Washington, for instance, I remember there was one Mr. Chakrapani. I think he was PTI, and either he was Washington or Geneva, I can't remember. They were very kind to me because suddenly they saw this young woman who really, frankly, was clueless. I mean, I'd read up about the Commonwealth and all that, but I didn't know how to go about, I didn't know how to meet people, how to get the information. So they sort of took me under their wing and showed me, how things work. And then I got to know some British journalists and some others who were all also, I think, partly because of my age, were very kind and, pointed me in the right directions. And I didn't have to do day-to-day reporting. No, I had to do these kind of overall things. And so, yeah, it was a great experience. I mean, after that, I've done a lot of that kind of conference reporting, but this was really, for me, something. I'm glad you reminded me because, with age, I'm forgetting a lot of these things. So, yeah, that was an amazing experience, the whole thing of the Commonwealth. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us, for the benefit of some of the younger journalists who might be here watching, you're talking about research, analog research. You're talking about going to an Indian Express library. Now, what? The Indian Express would just allow anybody to walk in back then? Because how did research work back then? Because right now, a lot of what we do actually is correcting the narrative. In the News Minute, for example, in News Laundry, there are stories which are badly written. Which takes us back to this broken news wala business, right? Which is that there are stories which the mainstream press would have really butchered. And we kind of go and set the narrative straight often. And that involves a lot of aggregation from online sources, speaking to people on the phone, checking out social media profiles. So there's a lot of research that happens online, Do you think that has added to the quality of journalism, this availability of information? Do you think back then, the fact that you could not aggregate information so quickly and it was not so readily accessible, was an impediment? How is analog research for journalism different from digital research, you think?
I mean, it's difficult to compare because there was no option, it was there. But I still think even today, I don't even use the term analog. Even today, if we read something in print, um, and take that trouble to do that kind of background reading, I think there is a qualitative difference, because the thing is, you pick up a book on whatever you're researching. So you don't just look at the one para that you need for your story. You end up looking at other things, and then you go back to it. It becomes an area of interest. The other thing I must mention is, at that point, EPW was another very useful resource, and Mr. Krishnaraj was again so kind. He would allow you to come and sit there and leaf through previous issues of EPW, which would again give you so much information. Um, and with Indian Express, there was, it's very ironical, but the resident editor was a man called Mr. Binod Rao. And again, I think because of his respect for Rajmohan Gandhi, when I went and met him, and they used to have their office in a very smelly part of Bombay called Sassoon Docks, which is the fishing wharf, basically. But he would permit me to come and sit there. And they also had a news editor called Mr. Krishnamurthy, SKM as he was called, who was also extremely kind. I think, they just thought we were not any threat to them. We were just a small weekly newspaper. But we had to do that footwork. We had to go, we had to find the things, we had to see who could give us the background. And I call it slow journalism, cooking it slowly also. But I think, I mean, maybe it had a value. It's hard to know. I mean, today, I think any diligent journalist, if they do the reading, kind of reading that is needed, and they're so lucky because they have so many resources available, uh, they would certainly be able to do far superior writing than we do. But what they have against that is, A, the speed with which they have to turn it out, B, the kind of space they're given, so that something that does require more space and more in depth, they're not given either the time or the space. So I think that is what affects the quality, because the issue is not assessed by the editorial teams on the basis of their importance, and therefore the kind of investment in time and energy and research that is needed to make them something that are of lasting value. Now it is like, turn it out quite, quickly. Yeah, TRPs and catching people's eyeballs, and I think that is the real reason that the quality has gone down, not whether you do analog research or digital.
Right, right. No, but I suppose in digital, the assumption is that it takes a lot less time, so churn out more, and that becomes a vicious cycle in itself, I'm guessing. But
But
Kalpana,
less time only if you have a very limited frame. But if you understand that some of these issues cannot be limited to a frame and require more, then it takes as much time, because you still have to read the whole thing, no? Whether you read it on a computer or you read it in print.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, and that's an important thing, I suppose. I mean, we keep trying to do that out here. If you see some of the pieces we have pulled out, and this is for our readers, like just recently we had Pooja's profile of Siddharamaya's. It took about 3 months to do. Right now, you go back into that era, the 70s, the 80s. You're reading books. You're speaking to people. There's an analog methodology. There's a digital thing, and there is actually just going and landing up in a library and looking at books. So we are still trying to somehow hold on to these practices. It's very difficult. And that's why we ask you for subscription money. But anyway, coming back, Kalpana, tell me this period of the mid-70s, emergency, you being in Himmat, paint those times for me. What was it like in Bombay? What were your convictions back then? How were the butterflies in your stomach? What was the risk like? This
Yeah.
mid-70s, what was
So
happening?
on the night the emergency was declared, we just happened to be sitting at a friend's place, and we heard about it. And so we switched on All India Radio, which was the only radio station at that time, and heard about the declaration of the emergency. So the next morning, Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi was not in Bombay, so we got on a trunk call to him, because that was the way you reached out, and said, what does this mean for us? Because nobody quite knew what this press censorship emergency, and even the news of those early arrests had not reached us, because you only got the news via teleprinter, and it hadn't been announced on the radio. And the morning newspapers of the 26th did not carry anything except declaration of emergency, which had taken place at midnight. and some of the early arrests. So we talked about it for the next few days because we had to bring out an issue, no? And so there was one thought that, if there's full press censorship, as we gathered there would be, that we should not submit to it, and it would be better to close down than to continue. There were others, and I think many of us younger people felt that no, we shouldn't close down, that we should fight it, not knowing what that meant, but we just felt, himmat. We are called himmat. We can't close down. So that prevailed. We said, let's see what happens. Let's try. So initially, as I said, there was a confusion which helped, because I think that is the one that left the space to try out. Like, everybody talks about the Indian Express and its blank editorials, but we also did that in Himmat. We also had blank editorials.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, everybody tried in various ways to do whatever they could, whoever wanted to resist. There were, of course, the pro-establishment newspapers which did not, which went by whatever the government said to them. But then soon we realized that a structure was being set up in the secretariat, in the Mantralaya, where there would be a chief censor, and we would have to go and take our copy to the chief censor. This is what we were first told. Then we were told, no, 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 there are these 26 guidelines which you have to follow. So we said, fine, let's see what these guidelines, and we'll work around it. So that is what we started to do in the initial months of the emergency. We didn't go to the censor. We just said, okay, we are following the guidelines. And of course, it was just a matter of, like, I think 3 or 4 months before we were caught out. We were too small to be, monitored. The bigger papers obviously were in the eye of the government. And there is where the censor actually sent a representative to the newsroom who would sit there and look at copy before it was printed. But for us, because nobody was monitoring us, we were getting away with sarcasm, with all kinds of things in which we were trying to say things. The cartoon, for instance, nobody looked at the cartoon. Our cartoonist was having a good time. A chap called Vince, Vijay and Seth. And then on October 2, there was a meeting held at Rajpath, which was attended by our editor-in-chief, Rajmohan Gandhi, Acharya Kripalani, etc. And that meeting was broken up by the police because they said there was Section 144. This was in Delhi. And these people were detained also for a short while, but then they were let off. So we ran the report, as we should. After all, our own editor was also detained. That report is what they said fell foul of the guidelines. So they said, we will suspend publication unless you, give that you're going to adhere to these guidelines, and full press censorship. That means every page of Himmat had to be sent to the censor. So that, on that basis, we went to the court along with Freedom First, Meenu Masani, who also challenged the guidelines and press censorship. And it was in Bombay High Court. Soli Sorabji fought that case for us pro bono. We didn't pay anything.
Quickly, how many people are you at this point?
Trying to remember. I think by this time, Mr. Lala was unwell, so he was not there. And actually, then he stepped down soon after, and I had to take over as the senior most amongst a very young crowd.
So you're not even 30 at this point.
No, not at all.
And you're heading this newspaper, news magazine.
Yeah.
Go on,
and
please. Yeah.
Then we had to figure out now what do we have to do with the censor. So, and the irony, as I was saying earlier, was Mr. Binod Rao, who was the resident editor of the Indian Express, was the chief censor in Bombay. He was there sitting in Mantralaya. So I thought, Mr. Rao, he's been so helpful to us, in Himmat, he'll be able to be kind to us. So I took the copy, and he was like one, super editor who would sit with a blue pencil and just knock things out. And I'd say, but why? And the other thing we had decided is, it was again a risk. I said, let's only show him the editorials and the main political article, and we will not show him Rajmohan Gandhi's column, which was the back page.
Which is called, I think, This is India? Is this what?
No, This India was Nirja Chaudhary.
Nirja Chaudhary, yeah.
And Rajmohan's, I forget now what his.
I'll try and put a screenshot of that. This is all part of journalism history in India. Anyway, go on. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a risk we took. We said, all the others are sport, find the ball. This was a life, some funny column, international news, which surely should not come in. And so we decided to take our chances. So we only showed him editorials and the first few pages. And even those he used to knock out. So we used to always have to keep a spare set of things in case one thing got knocked out. Or he would cut it so drastically it made no sense. You had to drop the article because you couldn't use it. So this went on for quite a long time, this thing. And then finally we decided we can't carry on like this. So we said, let's just get our own printing press. Because if it's your own print line, you can take a chance. We were printing at a established printing press, Janmabhoomi, which got very nervous with all this going on and actually had told us, please, we'll have to ask you to stop. We can't print you anymore. So find yourself another press. So it was really difficult finding another press because nobody was prepared to touch Himmat by then. So one of our issues, we put out an appeal to our readers. And you won't believe it, Sudipto, I still remember it. In those days, people sent money by money order, no? So we used to get money order for 5 rupees. We had readers, we had students who used to read Himmat as part of their general knowledge that they had to learn in their schools. We had some workers who got together and collected some money somewhere else. So this money just came in and we got, I think the total was something like 76,000 or something, which is a large amount in those days.
Yeah, and
So
I think your subscription was 15 rupees a year. And
yeah.
I saw one
Correct.
ad saying 3-year subscription for 40 rupees instead of 45.
That's right. So there was no way. And, ads, as I said, were very erratic. And during the emergency, as you know, they had also prepared a list of publications which were favorable, hostile, and very hostile. And this is what the advertisers knew. And especially the public sector advertisers, no? Like the banks and all, we counted on them to give us advertising. So we were very much in the hostile group. So we were not getting those ads. So it was some goodwill ads that we still got. And many private companies were also obviously afraid to associate, if they knew we had fallen foul.
So it's subscription money that kept you going, you're saying?
Subscription money and some, people gave donations. And in those days, there was no FCRA or anything. So people helped. And many of us actually didn't take a salary. We took hardly any salary, just enough, like very small amount. So Himmat just limped on till we got this press, which was, this generation would not know what a treadle machine is. But it's like there's a round plate like this and it goes and prints one page at a time. That's what a treadle machine is. So we could print Rajmohan Gandhi's back column, the editorials, the article that was on the back of the editorial page, and the ad or whatever was on the back of Rajmohan Gandhi's page, which was often letters to the editor and something called This Was a Life. So that one form, of 4 pages is what we could print on our printing press. But because we could do that, we could put our name as the print line. So we were the publishers and the printers. So anything that happened would come on us. And with that, we were able to persuade another printer to print him. That's how we worked our way around it. But even that guy finally got intimidated and he said, no, it's getting too risky. You'll have to show all the copy and I will only typeset it once you've shown me that there's a censor stamp on the copy. And luckily for us, just that last bit is when the elections were declared, which was 77. But 76 was a very difficult year because of this. It seemed like an endless year. And we got this printing press at the end of 76. And as you know, beginning of 77 is when Mrs. Gandhi declared the elections. And then she lost. And then the rest is history. Censorship was...
No, I kind of choked at points when you were describing how you stayed alive, because of, just made it told me, it reminded me how important truth is to some people, our readers who we don't know. You talked about people sending you subscription money and donations, and that happens even now. The situation we are in right now, right? And somebody sends in one 3,000 rupee check saying that, hey, I watch your show, here's something by way of support, and wow, it just so similar.
No, it's amazing actually. I mean, now when I look back on it, I often think, how on earth did we survive? But I think it is just, and we used to print 10,000 copies. That was our print run. But I think the readership was much bigger because each copy was read by, we think, an average of 10 people. And the goodwill was obviously there, that, a lot of it because of Rajmohan and the stand he took also. But I think generally it was a small news weekly. There were very few news weeklies of that type. There were Blitz, there was Current, um, and I think the BJP, the organizer, I think that was there.
RSS
Yeah, I'm
mouthpiece.
talking
Yeah.
In English, yeah. And all this Sunday and all this came much later. So that time there was no, and these were letterpress, and the color we had was that red color on the cover. But the rest of it was, very drab. And when you look at things these days, but I don't think people cared. I think they read the thing, for what it contained. So I am always amazed. I mean, after Himmat closed down, I was amazed at the amount of people who said they read Himmat. We used to joke in the office that people bought Himmat for the spot the ball, find the ball, as we used to call it, competition, which was for just to explain to people that a photograph of a cricket match of a in motion, and then you had to uh, cut it out and put where you think the ball was, and then it was sent to us by post, and then somebody would win it. And the other thing that was very popular with students was something called Viewpoint, which was a sort of essay competition where we'd give a controversial subject and people would write for and against it. And depending on the best argued short essay, that person would win some 15 rupees or 20 rupees or a free subscription to him or whatever. But this made it popular among especially senior school students, college students who used to. I met Salil Tripathi, the famous Salil Tripathi, won of these viewpoint competitions when he was in school.
Wow. Okay. Long live
Yeah.
Himmat. Yeah. So you could have possibly at that time you were what the only woman editor of a daily, perhaps an English daily, not a daily, but a magazine, weekly.
I, in English, yeah, I guess so. I never thought of it that way because
Who else
editor
was?
was like you were editor, but we were a team. I never thought of myself as editor.
No, but
That way.
you know why these things are important, right? And it's very important to sections of society who have been literally like denied that position because of the structure,
Yeah,
right? And
of course,
to
I
that
agree.
extent, you could have been perhaps what the first female editor in the 1970s, 1973, 4. But
I guess so. I don't really know. Yeah,
okay. No, but you know what? If you can, the editions between 73 and afterwards, I don't think they're available online. Do you have them?
yeah.
Is there an archive somewhere of Himmat?
There are some copies apparently that are kept and they're being digitized, but I think it's taking time. Yeah, I hope they do it soon because that paper newsprint on which it is printed
Yeah, it must be
will
withering.
it's going and it'll fray before long. So they should get it up. Yeah, yeah,
Right. Another kind of time lapse that I want you to get into is, the Indian women's movement, the feminist movement, in which you have played an important role as a documenter, as sometimes as a fly on the wall, sometimes as a very, as a participant as well. I picked up sections in your second book, where you talk about the different phases in this journey. In Silence and the Storm, you talk about the 80s and how a lot of the focus there perhaps was on violence against women, yes, but rape and domestic violence used to be the focus. And apart from that, the women's movement was very invested in the question of participation in the workforce, right? For women's work to be accounted, both at home, in the fields, right? This invisible labor needed to be quantified, and that was one of the important conversations at that juncture. And then the 90s roll in, and you are from fighting the capitalist structure and some kind of feudal patriarchy, you're also fighting Hindutva. You talk about the Roop Kanwar case, how in 85 you have this gang, right, of women journalists. There's Ammu Joseph, Meena Menon, and all this. What do you call
yes.
it? Do you have a name for yourselves? Is it,
Now we are called the Network of Women in Media. Yeah,
now you're called a network
NWM.
in women in media,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
this really forceful gang
And that
of
time we were just a bunch of like-minded women
like-minded.
journalists who came together. I think we gave ourselves some name. but we hadn't formed anything. But Geeta Seshu,
Yeah, yeah.
Meena Menon, they were all part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, teachers of mine as well. So, but no, but then you went to in 1985. You speak about how you went to Gujarat to cover the communal and the caste riots over there, and then you saw
Yes.
this fracture in the in the female consensus, so to speak, where you saw upper caste or Hindu women going after lower caste or non-Hindu women and provoking
Yeah.
mobs and inciting violence against women from another caste or religion. That was a major
Yes.
breach in the female unity that you were trying to promote. And then
Yeah.
finally in the 2000s you have this Raya Sarkar moment. So can we go step by step again in this as well? So the 80s, right? You're
Yeah.
talking about participation in the workforce, domestic violence, and rape. How has that as an issue developed over the years? The labor
Yeah.
question and the violence question.
So, in the 80s, I mean, for me personally, also, Himmat closed in 81. And I worked for a while with the Center for Science and Environment with Anil Agarwal to bring out that first citizens report on the state of India's environment. And then I joined Indian Express in 83. And this was really just when, the rape campaign had taken place uh, against the rape laws after the Mathura rape in 79. And the dowry deaths issue was very current. So there was a lot of writing, even, I mean, it was my first time in mainstream media also. But there was a lot of writing in mainstream media and reportage on these issues because it was in your face. It was a big social movement, the women's movement, which could not be ignored by the media. And yeah, so it was issue based, and it was very clear that the connection was between not just the individual woman who'd been raped, but also the larger system of justice, and therefore this demand for a change in the rape laws. So it was that broader thing of looking at how do you deal with our society, where a woman, especially if she's poor and a tribal woman, as in the case of Mathura, that you have no chance at all to succeed under existing laws, and therefore the demand to change it. And the same with the dowry laws. It was felt that this is hidden, we don't know about it. Even the press only reports it as crime briefs. Then some newspapers, like the Indian Express, in fact, did a series of dowry deaths in Delhi, just in different neighborhoods of Delhi, and created. And the media really played, mainstream media. I mean, to me, that 80s were like the golden period for the media. I think emergency was such a shock that I think even journalists who had not thought the importance of freedom of expression that we are entitled to in this country, I think woke up to the fact that this is what we ought to be doing. So human rights reporting on bonded labor, trafficking, apart from these things like violence against women, participation of women in the workforce. All these were like part of what was covered. It was not like a separate section. It became part of how we covered these things, and I think it's the kind of role the media can play in a democracy to keep these kind of issues center, because they see it also as an important part of what they're doing as media, you know which again sounds strange in the condition, in the situation we are in today, where the media, I don't think, even considers that these are the kind of issues that we should be focusing on.
No, I wanted to also know. So the 80s, we imagine it as an era of great workers' struggles. Mills are shutting down, PSUs are in trouble. The 90s are coming, and even before that, there are efforts to kind of disinvest, and so many other things are happening. The rumblings leading up to the liberalization period, right? In that, conversation, the entry of women in a conversation which is otherwise defined in Marxist terms as just labor, as having just a class identity, but to introduce a gender identity within that class conversation. How did you see that happening? How did you see conversations getting reshaped? This working class question suddenly had a gender component, right?
So that's not an issue that I can speak to with any kind of authority. I mean, I was a mainstream journalist. I was working with a newspaper, and I was focusing on gender. So I did bring in some of these things. But I think, apart from mill closures, let us also remember that 1984 Bhopal took place. and it's still considered one of the worst industrial accidents in the world. And that created another social movement, that is environmentalism, and the whole demand for sustainable development that where people don't pay a price, where the environment doesn't pay a price. This was another parallel thing in which actually I was very involved and writing about it, because I had done that stint with the Center for Science and Environment, and Anil Agarwal was like my guru, who really opened my eyes to so many aspects of environmental issues that then I carried forth. But I cannot for myself pinpoint any particular stage at which this whole issue of women within this larger question of labor came in. Frankly, I'm not in a position to.
But
Yeah.
women and Hindutva, right? This is another area in which you have focused a lot. Your book again talks about Mangalore, the pub attack. I was
Yes.
posted in Mangalore when the pub attack happened, and you mention it, and how in Roop Kanwar's case,
Yes.
it was a sati that had happened over there, and how the Sangh Parivar and the BJP did these shows of support. They took out these rallies, these jumlas that they
Yeah.
did to celebrate sati and all of that.
Yeah.
What reflections did that leave you with, that phase where you discovered this other threat to the feminist cause, Hindutva?
Again, when you're living through those periods, I don't, with hindsight, you
In
can call
hindsight,
it
yeah,
threat.
yeah, yeah.
Frankly, at that point, it was like another thing that has come up, and the Sati thing was a wake up call. And especially if you're based in a place like Mumbai, it doesn't strike you so much. I think if I was based in North India,
Yeah.
maybe I would have been more aware of it. But Mumbai at that point was still, even though there was Shiv Sena and
Yeah.
there had been, but it had not reached that point of, where you felt that this was something that was going to threaten the very basis. For us in Mumbai, I think the wake up time was 92, after the demolition of the Babri Masjid and the riots that followed. But and 84 before that in Bhiwandi. So there was a sense that something was happening. But I think even for many of us as journalists, it had not registered fully. But I think the Sati issue was something that certainly brought out the fact that people, in the name of tradition, which is linked to women, will perpetuate this kind of division, and as you say, they took out demonstrations, pro-Sati demonstrations, which is shocking given that Sati is banned in India. It's from a very long time. And again, for many of us not necessarily following these issues very closely as journalists, even though we had become there was a feminist consciousness that grown in all of us through this period of the 80s because of the women's movement. I think to locate all these things clearly, because it was happening as we went along, till 90 and Advani's Rath Yatra. I think it was in 90 with the Rath Yatra that it finally began to register, that there is this other things that are taking place. And, don't forget that at that point, in those early days, there were also these women in the BJP, RSS, who were very much in the forefront, Sadhvi, Rithambara, Uma Bharti, who were coming in passionate speeches at these rallies. And they were swaying a lot of women also, which
Some
we could
people even
see.
said that there's something called Hindutva feminism, if at all. Yeah.
There's a book actually that was written about the Shiv Sena women, which is very interesting. And that was, I mean, it came out later. But even the Shiv Sena was shifted, as you know, at that point and became much more, anti-Muslim, Hindutva, and then finally leading to 92 and the riots. Initially, it was not. It was very much like a, some people would call it a Gunda party, because basically they were local, strong men in the slums who could get things done. So they got the vote, because they knew how to get everything done. You needed a water connection, okay, we'll get it done. We should have a drain over here, okay, we'll get it done. So that was the ideology. Ideology was you get things done and then you get the vote, and then therefore you stay in power. But I think it changed very drastically with Bal Thackeray and his openly talking about Hindutva in his own language, which was different from the BJP and the RSS. So my personal experience, I think, and an understanding grew only after 1990, and that also because Rath Yatra was also in the north. So again, being based in Mumbai, even though of course one was following national news, that personal impact as a journalist did not happen unless you were covering those areas of Bihar and UP, and so I think journalists who were covering those areas would have had. I was not covering that, and I was based here in Mumbai. So yeah, but I think it was a factor that we had to get our heads around very quickly. And as I said, 92 just came on us, and suddenly you have to wake up to the fact that this is the reality now in India, whether we like it or not. Babri Masjid, I think, for all of us journalists, is something that will remain as, a black day, the day we actually saw this happening before our eyes, thanks to the BBC putting it out. And then what happened? The explosion in Mumbai, which some people had anticipated it, but many of us had not actually. And to wake up to the extent of the hate, you just scratch the surface of even people you knew, and you realize that it was so deeply embedded, this hatred, that they were not afraid to just talk about it. I think that was something that really is something we will not forget. Yeah.
No, a setback for human relations overall, not just for relations between
Yeah.
women and women. And it was, of course,
Yeah.
it kind of redid the entire set of equations that we worked with in the past. Now,
Yeah.
my last question or section, so to speak, is about the 2000s, and we talked about Raya Sarkar and things like that. There's a section from your book, I kind of found it interesting. I wrote it down. If you'll allow me, I'll read it.
Yeah.
You said that the Raya Sarkar case, you commented on it saying it speaks to the case with which more privileged among us can define a moment or movement entirely from our own perspective without recognizing the additional disadvantages that poor or Dalit women or women from minority communities might face. Here you're trying to reflect on how there may be limitations to how you might perceive things based on your location.
You're talking about Me Too, right?
Me
Yeah, because a
Too.
lot of people do
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
remember who Raya Sarkar
Yeah.
is.
We are
Yeah.
talking about Me Too. Thanks. Yeah, for keeping
Yeah.
it pegged. We're talking about 2017. Me Too is happening,
Yes.
and suddenly
Yes.
this Dalit feminist activist called Raya Sarkar comes up with a crowdsourced list of offenders and people who are potential offenders. So that was a list, and it came for heavy criticism from all sides, starting with, of course, progressive feminists who put out a statement in Kafila. Back then,
Hmm.
13
Right.
feminists had put out this statement. It had names such as Kavita Krishnan, Nivedita Menon, some very prominent names in the Indian feminist landscape, Janaki
Yeah.
Nair, and all that. So
Yeah.
the debate became about due process versus the experience of marginalized women who said that the process just doesn't work, right? And this became a contest between quote unquote Dalit or marginalized women and quote unquote Savarna women, and there were, of course, a third section saying we are all women, in the end of the day, and we are all suffering from patriarchy. But then someone would say, no, there is patriarchy has to be defined in terms of Brahminical patriarchy. All of these discussions were happening. Tell me,
Yeah.
Kalpana, I mean, we talk about coming of age discussions, and when we look at somebody like you and your career as somebody who's a journalist, which means you're literally on the nose of the rocket. You're discovering new isms, you're discovering new movements. You're coming of age every decade, literally, because based on what's happening in that decade. This decade of
Yeah.
the late 2000s, rather 2015, 16, 17, 18, those years. What were the big takeaways? What was happening within journalism, within the feminist movement, within NWMI? I'm sure these debates were breaking out in all kinds of feminist spaces. In hindsight, reflect on that, please.
Yeah. So, one general thing I'll say, that I think my understanding of, especially in India, of the feminist movement was that it was very much centered on larger issues, whether it was with violence or, women in the working class. And so there was a kind of, it was not an individualistic, it was not like what I have experienced, but what we have experienced, right? Those early battles. And that is the feminism with which I, in a way, got conscientized, to think about it. So that even though I was conscious of my own rights as a woman, but I was also conscious that I was privileged, and, and therefore, what I would say are my rights when I go and talk to a woman who lives on a pavement in Mumbai, her perception would be very different, what she sees. And I was conscious of that because of a decision I had made of in my reporting also to always refer these kind of things and try and find out what those without my privileges feel, on any issue, environment, on politics, and so on. So I think when the Me Too issue broke, as I see it, since the in societal terms in India, I think since liberalization and the change, the growth of the consumerist economy in India, I feel there's been a growth of this kind of individualism where you reduce many issues to the your individual. So even environmentalism, which in the 80s, Meda Patkar and Namaga Bachao Andolan, you think of post Bhopal and the whole struggle about location of industries, process of industries, the rights of people who work there and who live close to these hazardous industries. They're all part of a larger, framework of development and not just an individual. But through the 90s and around the world, this has happened that environmentalism became, I will not use plastic, I will not do this, I will not do that, rather than the larger issues that even today, development policy, for instance, the manner in which it has completely gone back, even on issues that we thought were settled, about forestation, for instance. Large dams around the world are being decommissioned, because their consciousness about the kind of damage they do. Location of industries, pollution, nobody writes about it, so we think pollution has disappeared. It has not. And as you yourself said, the fact that somebody can think of locating slum dwellers on a garbage dump shows you how little that consciousness has seeped into our policymakers and even in the media. There's not enough outrage. Um, so my problem, I guess, as an old-styled feminist, with reducing everything to what happens to me, is that if I use that for the larger issue of the fact that a woman has an equal right to a safe workspace and should be able to do that, and we have to create that. We have to have diversity in the workspace so there are enough of different types of people in any occupation. But we also have to have the systems where if I, as a woman or a Dalit woman or any kind of woman, is feels unsafe and feels preyed upon, I should have some access to that thing. So, to tell you the truth, I could not relate to the naming and the shaming because I didn't know whether it would really lead to a change or whether it would get just caught up in the naming and the shaming and not move beyond that. I've said that publicly also. Maybe it's a generational thing that I can't relate to because, as I said, I may have experienced a lot of things, but it's not me. That's not the issue. It's what we have to do with our society and how we have to bring about change. And that I feel should be the driving force in what we do. So I'm not saying that everything was wrong about this kind of strategy. And I will grant it that many of these younger women felt maybe that there is no system, so this is the only way to do it. Um, but we are in 2024, and what has happened since then? You know, even today, if we do a study of newspaper offices, for instance, in media houses, how many ICCs are actually working, internal complaints committees? How many women have just decided, forget it, we'll maneuver around it? How many women have walked out of jobs because they feel it's safer not to be in those kind of toxic environments? You keep hearing this every now and then. It doesn't part of a major conversation. So I think that is something for reflection. I mean, I don't think it's an either or. The feminists who wrote and said about process and the younger feminists who felt naming and shaming is the only way. I don't think those are like polar opposites that cannot meet somewhere. And I personally feel that you have to strive to somehow find common ground when actually our objective is the same. Our objective is a socially just society, you know, and we have to contribute towards that, whether we are writers, whether we're doing anything else. And how can we do that? So I'll leave it at that because it's a complex issue. It can't be like addressed this way. But this is what I've written. This has been my public position. So I'm not into this thing of, oh, I'm against this or I'm for this. I don't feel that leads to anything. It's not constructive. And if you have to move forward, and also labeling people, if you just label people and leave them with those labels, again, you give no chance at all for either side to find common ground. And I really feel that, because in my 50 years of experience, even as a journalist, the most trenchant type that I've had to talk to has often, when you talk to that person, turned out to be different from what I had presumed. And so as I said, maybe I'm an optimist and an idealist, and I believe that you can strive for a just world without, this kind of tearing people apart, tearing even those who are on the same side apart. That is what I'm saying. There is enough tearing of people apart. Let's not also get into that. That's all I'm saying.
Keeping fraternities, keeping the fabric. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, largely we're all on the same side. Let's find a way of having conversation and taking these issues forward. Why condemn people into, and put them into silos of this and that and the other? It doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't lead to any change.
Wow, it's been an hour and a half now since we've been talking, and yeah, and I'm afraid we are out of time. But I was just looking back at this time that we had, and the ground that we covered: 50 years of journalism, 50 years of feminism, 50 years of Indian democracy. Such a fantastic discussion, Kalpana. Thank you so much. And some of the discussions, of course, are like you said, rabbit holes in themselves, and I hope to kind of continue these discussions, have you here again. This is just the first year that I'm doing this. This year is coming to an end now. In the coming year, I want to have all the guests who came in the first year all over again, because there are points that we touch upon but we can't go into depth. But next time we should go into depth into some of these issues. And of course, for the sake of our audience, this is a section of women that I admire, who helped me in my career. From some I learned from a distance. Some of them taught me by hand. For instance, Geeta Seshu and Ammu Joseph were always visiting. I mean, Ammu is in Bangalore. Geeta used to keep visiting. Parvati Menon, Sugandhi Ravindranathan, C.K. Meena. These are the doyens of that generation, and I hope to get every one of them on the show if possible. I think Ammu is going to be here soon in the show, C.K. Meena as well. One day we might have all three of you in the same room, and I wonder what will come out of that discussion. For now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to leave it here. Kalpana, thank you so much for being on What's Your ISM. Any final
Thank you.
comments?
No, I wish you all the best. I mean, it's a great thing that TNM is there, and I hope that it flourishes and grows.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.